Sometimes my nephew Raymond West, who writes those very modern books about unpleasant young men and women, which are so very clever, I'm sure, accuses me of being hopelessly Victorian. Well, I am. But one thing about being a Victorian, which a lot of young people seem to have lost sight of these days, is the ability to apply plain, common sense. And I believe I really did solve a problem that baffled cleverer heads than mine by doing just that. I don't want to appear vain, but, well, I couldn't help being just a teeny-weeny bit pleased with myself. The first I knew of this business was one evening about 9 o'clock, when Gwen, my little maid with red hair, knocked lightly on the dining-room door. "Excuse me, ma'am. Mr. Petherick and a gentleman have called to see you. I've shown them into the drawing-room, only there's no fire." "Oh, no, indeed, no. You did the right thing, Gwen. Bring us some cherry brandy and some glasses." Mr. Petherick, what on earth is he doing here? I do hope there's nothing wrong with my investments.
"Ah, Miss Marple, forgive the intrusion."
"Not at all. I was just, well, you see, there's no fire in here. I always think it's such a waste to keep 2 fires in the summer, even though the evenings get quite chilly, so I only have one in the dining-room. I don't suppose—"
"But we'd be delighted to come into the dining-room, Miss Marple, of course. What could be more civilized? Allow me to introduce my friend. This is Mr. Rhodes."
"Good evening, Miss Marple." "Good evening, Mr. Rhodes. Do sit down. Gwen is bringing us some cherry brandy."
"Now, Miss Marple, you must forgive an old friend for taking such a liberty, but what I have come here for is a consultation."
"A consultation? I'm not sure I understand."
"Well, in a case of illness, one likes to take 2 points of view, that of the specialist and that of the family physician. It is the fashion to regard the former as of more value, but I'm not sure I agree. The specialist has experience in his own subject only, whereas the family doctor, well, perhaps has less knowledge, but a wider experience."
"Oh, I know just what you mean. A young niece of mine, not very long ago, she hurried her child off to a well-known specialist in skin diseases without consulting her own doctor at all. She considered him rather an old dodderer, I'm afraid. The specialist ordered very expensive treatment. They later found that all the child was suffering from was a rather unusual form of measles."
"Well, exactly my point. That's why I brought Mr. Rhodes to you."
"If Mr. Rhodes is ill—"
"Oh, indeed I am. I expect to die of a broken neck in a few months' time. You may have read, Miss Marple, of the murder in Barnchester."
"I'm afraid I haven't."
"Oh, it was in the local papers, I'm sure."
"Oh, indeed, I'm sure. Barnchester is only about 20 miles from us, but I'm afraid we've had a lot of excitement in the village lately over our district nurse. Outside experiences, like an earthquake in India or even a murder in Barnchester, although much more important, I know, I'm afraid have been crowded out by our little local excitements. Villages are like that. I do remember something about a woman having been stabbed in a hotel. I didn't remember her name."
"Well, that was Mr. Rhodes' wife."
"I see."
"And he is under suspicion of having murdered her."
"I see."
"Let me explain. You see, the coroner's jury brought in a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, but we have reason to believe that Mr. Rhodes will be arrested within a day or 2, and he came to me and placed himself in my hands. His father is an old friend of mine. Well, this afternoon we went and consulted Sir Malcolm Oldcasey, in the event of the case coming to trial. A specialist, if you like. He's a young man, Sir Malcolm, very up-to-date in his methods. He indicated a certain line of defence, but I am not entirely satisfied. He's grasped the whole picture. You see, my dear lady, it is tainted with what I call the specialist's point of view. Give Sir Malcolm a case, and he sees only the one point, the most likely line of defence. But even the best line of defence may ignore completely what is, to my mind, the vital point. It takes no account of what actually happened. Now you, my dear lady, if I may say so, have great acumen and judgment with human nature, and Mr. Rhodes has agreed for me to tell you the story of his case in the hope that, well, You might be able to suggest some alternative explanation.
I could see that Mr. Rhodes was highly sceptical of me being of any use, and he was rather annoyed at being brought here. But Mr. Petherick took no notice, and proceeded to give me the facts of what had occurred on the night of March the 8th. Mr. and Mrs. Rhodes had been staying at the Crown Hotel in Barnchester. Mrs. Rhodes, who, well, so I gathered from Mr. Petherick's careful language, was perhaps just a shade of a hypochondriac, and she had retired to bed immediately after dinner. She and her husband occupied adjoining rooms with a connecting door. Mr. Rhodes, who was writing a book on prehistoric flints, settled down to work in the adjoining room. At 11 o'clock he tidied up his papers and prepared to go to bed. Before doing so, he just glanced into his wife's room to make sure that there was nothing she wanted. He discovered the electric light on, and his wife lying in bed, stabbed through the heart. She'd been dead at least an hour, probably longer. The following were the main points. There was another door to Mrs. Rhodes's room leading into the corridor. This door was locked and bolted on the inside. The only window in the room was closed and latched. According to Mr. Rhodes, nobody had passed through the room in which he was sitting except a chambermaid bringing hot water bottles. The weapon found in the wound was a stiletto dagger, which had been lying on Mrs. Rhodes's dressing table. She was in the habit of using it as a paper knife. There were no fingerprints on it. So the situation boiled down to this. No one but Mr. Rhodes and the chambermaid had entered the victim's room. I inquired about the chambermaid.
Well, that was our first line of inquiry. Mary Hill. She's a local woman. She's been the chambermaid at the Crown for 10 years. There seems absolutely no reason why she should commit a sudden assault on a guest. She is, in any case, extraordinarily stupid, almost half-witted. Her story has never varied. She brought Mrs. Rhodes her hot water bottle, and says the lady was drowsy, just dropping off to sleep. Frankly, I cannot believe, and I am sure no jury would believe, that she committed the crime. And the layout of the hotel is such that if anyone else had entered or left the room, they would almost certainly have been seen. At the head of the staircase in the Crown Hotel is a kind of miniature lounge where people sometimes sit and have coffee. A passage is off to the right, and the last door in it is the door into the room occupied by Mr. Rhodes. The passage then turns sharply to the right again, and the first door around that corner is the door into Mrs. Rhodes's room. Now, as it happened on the night in question, both these doors could be seen by witnesses. The first door into Mr. Rhodes's room, I'll call that door A, that was seen by 4 people, 2 commercial travellers and an elderly married couple who were having coffee. According to them, nobody went in and out of door A, except Mr. Rhodes and the chambermaid. As to the other door, in passage B, there was an electrician at work there, and he also swears that nobody entered or left door B except the chambermaid.
It is certainly a very curious case, most interesting. On the face of it, I can quite understand how it looks that Mr. Rhodes must have murdered his wife.
I didn't. But how can I possibly prove it? Tell Miss Marple about the threatening letters.
Oh, yes. Well, I mentioned it at the inquest, of course. We'd received some threatening letters. They were rambling, ridiculous things. My wife said there was something about a woman whose child was injured in a motor accident, and she was vowing vengeance on my wife. Well, to be absolutely honest, I didn't take too much notice of them. Mrs. Rhodes, I gathered, was one of those romantic liars who go through life embroidering everything that happens to them. The amount of adventures that, according to her own account, happened to her in a year was simply incredible. If she slipped on a bit of banana peel, it was a case of near escape from death. If a lampshade caught fire, she was rescued from a burning building at the hazard of her life. Her husband got into the habit of discounting her statements. So the story of a woman whose child had been injured, the incident had happened before he married his wife, and although she had read him the letters, he suspected her of composing them herself. She had actually done such a thing once or twice before. She was a woman of hysterical tendencies who craved ceaselessly for excitement. Now, all this to me seems very natural. Indeed, we have a young woman in the village who does much the same thing. The danger with such people is that when anything at all extraordinary really does happen to them, nobody believes they're speaking the truth. It seemed to me that this was what happened in this case. The police, I gathered, merely believed that Mr. Rhodes was making up this unconvincing tale in order to avert suspicion from himself. I asked if there had been any women staying by themselves at the hotel. It seemed there were 2.
Yes, Mrs. Granby. She's an Anglo-Indian widow. And a Miss Carruthers. She's rather a horsey spinster type. Drops her G's, you know the type. The most minute inquiries have failed to elicit anyone who saw either of them at the scene of the crime, and there is nothing to connect either of them with it in any way.
Can you describe the personal appearance of each lady, Mr. Rhodes?
Mrs. Granby, reddish hair, rather untidily done, sallow-faced. I suppose she's about 50 years of age. Her clothes are rather picturesque, mostly native silk, etc. I suppose it's the Anglo-Indian influence. Miss Carruthers, 40-ish, wears a pince nez, close-cropped hair, but like a man, wears rather mannish coats and skirts, come to think of it.
Dear me, that makes it very difficult.
It's a hopeless case, Miss Marple. We may as well give up now.
Oh, really, Mr. Rhodes? There's no such thing as a hopeless case, not if one is innocent. What did Sir Malcolm Old say?
Well, Sir Malcolm was confident of being able to call conflicting medical testimony to suggest some way of getting over the fingerprint difficulty. The case he will make is that Mrs. Rhodes killed herself.
She wasn't that kind of woman. Doctors are all fools. Certainly hysterical people don't usually commit suicide. Does the door from Mrs. Rhodes' room lead straight into the corridor?
No, there's a little hallway with a bathroom and a lavatory. It's the door from the bedroom to the hallway that was locked and bolted on the inside.
Oh, well, in that case the whole thing seems remarkably simple. The simplest thing in the world.
Well, I'm sorry, Miss Marple. You really do have the advantage of us. Perhaps Miss Marple hasn't quite appreciated all the difficulties.
Yes, I think I have. There are 4 possibilities. Either Mrs. Rhodes was killed by her husband, or by the chambermaid, or she committed suicide, or she was killed by an outsider whom nobody saw enter or leave.
And that is impossible. Nobody could come in and out through that room without me seeing them. Even if anyone did manage to come in through my wife's room without the electrician seeing them, how the devil did they get out again, leaving the door locked and bolted on the inside?
Well, Miss Marple, I decided perhaps Mr. Rhodes had had enough cherry brandy, and so I moved the tray to one side. I should like to ask you a question, Mr. Rhodes. What did the chambermaid look like?
Well, she was tallish. I'm not sure if she was fair or dark.
Mr. Petherick, you interviewed her afterwards?
Yes, medium height, fairish hair, blue eyes, rather a high colour. Well, you're a better observer than I am, Petherick.
No, I wouldn't say so. No, not at all. Can you describe my maid who opened the door to you?
No, I'm not entirely sure I can. Tallish, I think. I'm afraid I didn't really notice.
No, neither did I. I'm afraid I have other things on my mind, Miss Marple. Don't you see what that means? You both came here full of your own affairs, and the person who let you in was only a parlour-maid. The same applies to Mr. Rhodes at the hotel. He saw her uniform and her apron. He was engrossed in his work. But Mr. Petherick interviewed the same woman in a different capacity, and he looked at her as a person. That's what the woman who did the murder counted upon. I think this is how it went. The chambermaid came in by door A, and passed through Mr. Rhodes's room into Mrs. Rhodes's room with the hot water bottle, and then she went out through the hallway into passage B. X, as I will call our murderess, came in by door B into the little hallway, and concealed herself, in the smallest room, and waited until the chambermaid had passed out. Then she entered Mrs. Rhodes's room, took the stiletto from the dressing-table — she'd doubtless explored the room earlier in the day — went to the bed, stabbed the dozing woman, wiped the handle of the stiletto, locked and bolted the door by which she had entered, and then passed out through the room where Mr. Rhodes was working.
But I should have seen her. The electrician would have seen her go in.
No, that is where you're wrong. You wouldn't see her. Not if she were dressed as a chambermaid. You were engrossed in your work. Out of the tail of your eye you saw a chambermaid come in, go into your wife's room, come back, and go out. It was the same dress, but not the same woman. That's what the people having coffee saw. A chambermaid go in, and a chambermaid come out. The electrician did the same. I dare say if a chambermaid were very pretty, a gentleman might notice her face, human nature being what it is. But if she were just an ordinary middle-aged woman, well, it would be the chambermaid's dress, you would see, not the woman herself.
Who was she?
Well, that is going to be a little difficult. It must be either Mrs. Granby or Miss Carruthers. Mrs. Granby sounds as though she might wear a wig normally, so she would wear her own hair as a chambermaid. On the other hand, Miss Carruthers, with her close-cropped mannish head, might easily put on a wig to play her part. I dare say you will find out easily enough which of them it is. Personally, I incline myself to think it will be Miss Carruthers. And so it turned out. Carruthers was a false name, but she was the woman all right. There was insanity in her family. Mrs. Rhodes, who was a most reckless and dangerous driver, had run over her little girl, and it had driven the poor woman off her head. She concealed her madness very cunningly, except for writing those distinctly insane letters to her intended victim. She had been following her about for some time, and she laid her plans very cleverly. The false hair and maid's dress she posted away in a parcel first thing the next morning. When taxed with the truth, however, she broke down and confessed at once. The poor thing is in Broadmoor now, completely unbalanced, of course, but it was a very cleverly planned crime. Mr. Petherick came to me afterwards with a very nice letter from Mr. Rhodes. Really, it quite made me blush.
Just one thing, though, Miss Marple. Why did you think it more likely to be Carruthers than Granby? You'd never seen either of them?
Oh, well, it was the G's. He said she dropped her G's. Now, that's done by a lot of people in books, hunting and fishing, that sort of thing. But I don't know many people who do it in reality, and certainly no one under 60. You said this woman was 40-ish. Those dropped G's sounded to me like a woman who was playing a part, and rather overdoing it. Mr. Petherick was very complimentary to me. I really couldn't help feeling a teeny-weeny bit pleased with myself. It's extraordinary how things turn out for the best in the world. Mr. Rhodes has married again, a very nice, sensible girl, and they've got a dear little baby. Well, what do you think? They asked me to be godmother. Wasn't it nice of them? Now, I do hope you don't think I've been running on too long.